Hello and welcome to your week 3 lecture. What we'll be covering today is measures of association. So these are your following learning objectives. We'll be learning how to quantify associations for cohort study, for cross-sectional case control study. We'll be looking into key concepts, which is validity and reliability. And the threats to validity and reliability is a post-reading. It's a post reading, it is not assessed, so don't worry, it won't be part of your quizzes, for instance. All right, but if you are intending to take up research in the future, then I strongly encourage you to go over these post readings. This is just for your own knowledge. All right, threats to validity and reliability, those slides. All right, okay, so basically, how is this information going to be useful for you in your real life setting? Is when you will understand how do you quantify associations, you'll be better able to interpret the statistical data which is there in research papers. All right, so for instance, if you have things such as individuals smoking are 4 times more likely to develop cancer than individuals who are not smoking, you will be able to understand what exactly does this mean? What did the researcher do to come to this conclusion? Okay, so you will be able to understand statistical data clearly after this lecture. Okay, and definitely this prepares you for job interviews, especially if, as I said, if your role is dual focus meaning you have part clinical role and part, say, research role, that is where these skills are very helpful. Okay, so we'll be moving forward. So these are your pre-readings. As I said, pre-readings, I have tried to make them as engaging and as easy as possible rather than giving you research papers. So these are the 3 YouTube links which I would like you to view before you go on further into this lecture. Okay. All right. So basically, what is the main aim of today's lecture is to understand associations. When I say about understanding association, meaning understanding the relationship, the correlation between your independent variable and your dependent variable. Right? So your independent variable is your exposure, okay? And whereas your dependent variable is the outcome. It is the result of the exposure. Okay, so for example, smoking causes cancer. Smoking is the exposure and the outcome is cancer, which is the dependent variable. All right, so this is what our main aim is of this lecture, which is to understand associations. Now, how do you understand associations? You understand associations by quantifying associations. Okay, so what are the various methods of quantifying association in big epidemiological report? These kind of quantification methods, which I'm saying, such as attributable fractions and population attributable risk and fraction, these kind of things are done in very large reports, governmental reports. Whereas if you have, say, smaller studies, such as, say, a cross-sectional study, a case control study, they will be reporting things such as odds ratios. But if you see, even risk ratios, for instance, are reported in a lot of research papers. So this is how this lecture will help you to understand bivariate association. So if you have done a bit of quantitative statistics, you have bivariate associations and you have multivariate associations. I'll talk more about these associations in your tutorial, but basically these measures of association that we are talking about in this lecture, this is to understand bivariate association, meaning simple association between an IV and a DV. All right. So yes, various methods for quantifying cohort studies, prospective cohort studies. And if you remember my lecture on study design, what does prospective cohort study mean? It means like longitudinal design. It could be prospective in nature or retrospective in nature. So basically for these kind of studies, what is commonly reported is rate ratio, risk ratio. So in the most commonly reported items in, say, original research, and now I won't be defining all of this because I have actually explained this to you in week 2's lecture. So in original articles, the most common type of reporting comes with rate ratios and risk ratios. In big governmental documents, you're more likely to see this sort of, say, variables which are calculated, such as attributable risk, attributable fractions, population attributable risk. So this is done at a more larger scale. Original research, majority of the time you will see rate ratio, risk ratio, which is reported. Very easy to calculate. I'll be showing you hand calculations, but as I have said, guys, all of this can be done in SPSS, these simple bivariate calculations. All right. But of course, it is not part of this unit, so I can't teach, I can't go into quantitative statistics. I have to keep into the realm of epidemiology. All right, and yes, for case control studies, cross-sectional studies, the most important, the most common variable or the factor which is reported is odds ratios. All right, so moving further. My apologies. This is not letting me move further. Okay, all good. All right, so guys, we'll be looking at how to calculate rate ratios, risk ratios, attributable risk, population attributable risk, and fractions. Okay, so this is, as I said, most commonly reported in prospective cohort studies. And the two most important things which you'll see generally in almost all papers, which are, say, cohort studies, is rate ratios and risk ratios. All right, so we will be learning the hand calculations, but as I said, guys, if you do have the opportunity to go further in research with quantitative data analysis, then rest assured this is all done in SPSS. So don't worry, it's not that you have to calculate all of this for each and every sample of yours in real life. Okay, so you don't have to do it by your hand. All right, guys, so the first one is rate ratio. And as it said, it is also called as incidence density ratio. Okay, so let me first read out the definition and then I'll be definitely explaining the calculations using examples, which is what we always do. All right, so rate ratio is the incidence rate or person's time rate or mortality rates in an exposed group. So now see, this term is important. All right, in an exposed group divided by the incidence rate, person times rate, or mortality rate, depending upon what the research question is, rates in an unexposed group or less exposed group. All right, so you are comparing two groups over here. Okay, so you have an exposed group and you have an unexposed group, or else it could be a less exposed group. All right, so and this is the formula for it, rate ratio, where you have IR, the capital IR is incidence rate. Now, if you don't remember what the term incidence mean in epidemiology versus prevalence, please go back to lecture 1, I think. All right, because this is very important for you to remember what is incidence and how is it different from prevalence. Okay, so I won't go into all of that right now, but I'll just keep hinting. So in case if you have forgotten, it's good to go back to your week 1 lecture and revise those concepts. Okay, so you have incidence rate, then you have your small e for exposed group and U for unexposed group. And if you have a rate ratio, which is say equal to 1, meaning the rate of something happening is equal in both groups. When you have greater than 1, meaning there is an increased risk in the exposed group, less than 1, there is a decreased risk in the exposed group. Okay, so this which is there, which is where you have a ratio of greater to 1, less to 1, and equal to 1, that even follows the same format for odds ratios. All right. Okay, so now this is our example. So I'll first walk you through the table. Sorry, I have to keep hovering my image screen because I can't see the table otherwise. All right, so remember we are calculating rate ratios, which are also called as incidence density ratio. So in case if some other term is used, incidence density ratio, don't get confused. Okay, so for instance, you have people who are going to a church, all right? So if they have gone to a church on a Saturday, they are the exposed group, okay? Because they are severely exposed to food poisoning, all right? And then if you have people who have gone to the church on Sunday, okay, they have either gone on Saturday or either gone on Sunday. We haven't considered the group who may have gone both days. Okay, so that is another sort of a third variable. That is not what we are doing right now. Okay, so for you to understand, they have either gone on a Saturday. If they have gone on a Saturday, they are the exposed group because they are severely exposed to food poisoning. If they have gone on a Sunday, they are the non-exposed group or the mildly exposed group. all right, because they not many have been exposed to food poisoning. All right, so think of it as someone going to church on a Saturday, and after the service they have, say, a small little tea gathering in the garden or something like that, which is what it generally happens. All right, so it may be a social scenario as such, and those who went on a Saturday, a lot of them suffered food poisoning. All right, 20 versus 5, okay, who have gone on a Sunday. Then these are the cases of people meaning number of people. These are all number of people over here. Okay, so number of people who went on a Saturday but did not get food poisoning, and number of people who went on a Sunday but did not get food poisoning. All right, and this is the total number of people, 75, which is 20 plus 55, like that. All right, now when we use the formula, very simple. So guys, again, I have used the same strategy. You know how I keep highlighting the places where I've taken those numbers for calculation. So I've done the same thing. So the blue boxes over here are taken for calculation. So it makes it easier for you when you are revising for your, say, quiz, okay, for your second quiz. So now, for instance, when you have rate ratio, you have exposed group, meaning 20, all right, 20 people, divided by unexposed group. In our case, it is less exposed group. It is not that they are completely not exposed. We do have a few cases of food poisoning, so it is mildly exposed. All right. So yes, you have your mildly exposed group. So 20 divided by 5, 4. So what is the answer over here? The rate of food poisoning was 4 times higher among people attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. All right. So as simple as it can get. Okay, it can't get more simple than this. It's very easy, and generally rate ratios, as I said, and risk ratios are what you most probably are likely to see in original research articles. Okay, for prospective cohort studies or retrospective cohort studies. All right, so now you have the second one, which we are learning, which is risk ratios. They are also called as relative risk. Guys, if I had to see what is most commonly reported between the two, which is, say, this rate ratio versus risk ratio is more popular one, which is reported in research papers. Okay, so you have your risk ratio over here, or relative risk. So a risk ratio, so RR, okay, so a risk ratio, also called as relative risk, compares the risk of a health event. Okay, so it compares the risk of a health event. It could be a disease, it could be an injury, it could be a risk factor, or it could be death. All right, so it compares the risk of health event among one group with the risk among the other group. Okay, so when we talk about group, meaning it considers the entire group, people who are healthy in that group, people, the total number of people. That will make more sense when I show you the example in the next slide. Okay, but basically it all depends upon the definition, because the calculation is completely the same. All right, so now you again have the same sort of a calculation. You have risk ratios over here, where you have incidence risk. Okay, so incidence risk and exposed group versus unexposed group. Over here, if you see the definition, you had incidence rate. Okay, so that's the only difference. But if you see the main mathematical formula which we are using is division. Okay, it's nothing else, it's the same thing, it's division. All right, so over here you have incidence rate, whereas over here, if you want to calculate, say, risk ratio, the correct terminology is incidence risk. But the formula, if you see, it remains the same. All right, so incidence risk, then you have exposed, unexposed group, and this stays as follows. All right, because these are ratios. So greater than 1, equal to 1, less than 1, that's all the same. Okay, the interpretation of it. So now you have your risk ratios or relative risk, RR. Okay, so now over here, if you look at the definition again, it is compares the risk of a health event among one group. Risk of a health event among one group. Okay, so risk of a health event among one group. All right, so over here, the risk of a health event is 20 people. All right, among one group. What is the total number of people? 75. Risk of a health event in other group is 5. What are the total number of people? 60. Okay, so now if you have to put this in a formula, this is how you will do it. So you have 20 people divided by total number of people, which is 75. Then you have 5 people over here divided by 60. So again, these highlighted columns are the ones which you are using as part of the calculation, just to make it easier for you to remember during your quiz time. Okay, so then you just divide it, you get this answer 0.27, 0.08. All right, so the risk ratio, it's not ratio, that's my bad. Sorry, I'll correct it and then I'll put it up. So this is risk ratio. Risk ratio is your 0.27 divided by 0.08, which is this number 3.357, so 3.4%. Okay, so the risk of food poisoning was 3.4 times higher among people attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. All right, so guys over here, early on in your career, if you're not very apt with quantitative research, what students generally do is, because you have calculated risk ratios, it's important to use the term risk and not odds. Generally, students, they write it in this style, which is the odds of food poisoning was 3.4 times higher. No, these are not odds ratios. All right. So when you have used the formula for risk ratio, you have to say it in the terms of where you're using the term risk in your statement sentence. All right, not the term odds. Okay, so when you're writing down the results, use the word risk because you're calculating risk ratios. When you're calculating odds ratios, that is the appropriate time to use the word odds. All right. Okay, so I hope this makes sense to you. It's really simple and straightforward. I think the calculations which you had in week 1, they were a bit more challenging compared to these calculations. These calculations are really simple. If you get through your week 1 calculations, this is really easy peasy. And today's lecture is also very short, so you'll be happy about that as well. Okay. All right. So, yep. So as I said, everything just lies in the minor difference in the definition between the two. All right. Rate ratios and risk ratio. Over here, ratio of the rate of an event in one group versus the other. Over here, you have risk of an event in one group versus the other. There is a very, very minor change in the calculation, because with risk ratio, you are considering the total population, okay, which is what you don't do with your rate ratios. So nothing else, it's not a major difference. All right, so yes, rate, where you have summary measures. What does it measure? Risk over time. All right, whereas where you have risk ratios, what does it do? It measures the probability of occurrence of a given event. Okay, so basically this is more textbook material, but if you had to do this in your real life, if you really had a real life data set in front of you, which is say prospective cohort study or retrospective cohort study, if you had a cohort study, I would strongly encourage you to calculate risk ratios, all right, because these are most commonly reported in the paper. This is one more FYI hint for you guys, is that when you're working in so and so sort of say a research topic or a research area, it's very important to look at similar research which has been done in the literature, because that will give you amazing ideas as to, okay, how is it that other people have done similar research? What are the statistical techniques they have used? What are the methodological approaches they have used? And what are there any such statistical techniques and methodological approaches that you can adapt and you can implement in your sample to make it stronger, to make your analysis stronger, to make your methodology stronger? Therefore, reviewing of literature is so very important. All right, so again, as I said, my lectures have a lot of FYIs in between. So this is just an FYI to keep in mind. For instance, as I said, the picky eating study, which I'm doing at the moment. So currently I have collected around 334 mothers. And very soon, once I finish my data collection, I'll start say writing papers, analyzing data and things. From now onwards, I'm looking at all the literature which is available in this space to see. And even before that, before I started my research, I looked at the research papers to see what sort of methodological approaches they have used. Is there any methodological approaches I can use for my data collection? So you see, before you actually collect data, it is so important to review your literature. Then once I've collected my data, I'll review the entire literature again to see, are there any sophisticated statistical analytical techniques which I can implement in my data set? Okay, so this is how it's so important to keep refreshing with your literature, with the existing literature. All right. Okay. So now we will be calculating attributable risk. Okay, so attributable risk, AR, is the most popular terminology which is used. That's why I have made it blue in color. Okay, but the other terminologies are not that they are not used, but they are just not that popular, which is risk difference or rate difference. Okay, so I'll just commonly term it as attributable risk because that is what generally is reported. And as I said, starting now on, these things are more likely to be reported in large governmental documents data sets. Okay. Not that they are not reported in original articles or original research, but they are more likely to be reported in governmental documents. All right, so what is attributable risk now? So attributable risk is the difference between the incidence of disease in the exposed population versus incidence in the unexposed population. Now, again, for you to understand this definition, remember what incidence mean. Week 1 lecture. Okay, so in other words, the attributable risk is the extent to which the incidence of disease would be reduced had the individuals not been exposed to the exposed item. All right. So it will all make sense, guys, once we look at the example. Okay. And very important over here, this is an important point, which is attributable risk. It helps you to understand the strength of an association, and it indicates causality. Causality meaning, you know how I said only randomized controlled trials are the one which can confirm a causal relationship, meaning smoking causing cancer. So for you to use the word causing is only possible if you are doing a randomized controlled trial. If you're not doing a randomized controlled trial, which is a strong randomized controlled trial, not just any, because as I said, you have say double blind placebo controlled randomized controlled trial. Those are the stronger type of randomized controlled trial. Only RCT can say confirm causality. Attributable risk, as I said, is done with prospective cohort study, meaning longitudinal study, where you may have say 10 years of data, 15 years of data. It may indicate, it may hint causality. It may say, basically what is it saying, that if you have strong attributable risk, it may say it would be worthwhile. Basically it is saying, attributable risk is trying to say, if it was a person, this is what it would say. Basically you should investigate this using an RCT if it is possible for you, because the attributable risk number or the outcome is strong. All right, so that is what it means. All right, so attributable risk is a better indicator than a relative risk ratio, which is what we saw previously. We learned about it, and it is good for preventative based interventions. All right, so say a healthy eating and lifestyle intervention to prevent coronary heart disease. Okay, so preventative based intervention. All right. So now what is the formula for attributable risk? Over here you have incidence risk. Again, now what does incidence mean? Week 1. Okay, so incidence risk, and then you have your exposed group and you have your unexposed group. But remember over here, there is a subtraction sign. Okay, so till now we were doing division. Over here, there is a subtraction sign. Okay, so with an example, everything will become very clear. All right. So now this is our example. Let me just move myself on the other end. Sorry guys, because I keep have to moving my own screen. Otherwise, it's blocking what I have written. All right. So yes, now we are learning how to calculate attributable risk. All right. So here we have the exposed group. You know, the exposed group are people who went to the church on Saturday. All right. And you have your mildly exposed group, or else say unexposed group, but it is not technically unexposed. But yeah, that's say our second group, which is people who went on the went to church on Sunday. All right. So again, it's the same thing. If you see the calculation, the columns highlighted are same, which are there for relative risk. Okay, so I'll just quickly run through that. It's just this is what will help you to understand better. So relative risk, if you see, the same columns are highlighted. All right, and if I go over here, again the same columns are highlighted. But remember, over here, there is a subtraction sign. Over there was a division sign. Why am I keeping on reinforcing all of this? Is because this will help you to not only understand concept, but it will help you to perform well in your quizzes as well. Okay. So now if we put in the numbers in the formula, so firstly, you have your, say, 25 divided by 75, 5 divided by 60, the same thing. You have the same numbers over here. The only difference is now you're minusing it. Okay, so we have minus. So 0.27 minus 0.08. Okay, so it's 0.19, which is 19%. Okay, so 19% of disease risk. Now, understand this sentence. 19% of disease risk. What is our disease over here? Basically, it's not disease, but yeah, 19% of the exposure risk, you can say, which is food poisoning, can be attributed to people attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. All right. So now if we look over here, in other words, attributable risk is the extent to which the incidence of disease would be reduced had the individuals not been exposed to the factor, okay, which is food poisoning. So 19% of the disease risk can be attributed to, meaning 19% of food poisoning cases can be attributed to people attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. This is what it is trying to say. Okay, so you see it's a very, very thin line difference between attributable risk and relative risk. Over here, it is talking more in terms of what could have been avoided, or else how much of the entire proportion is really responsible for food poisoning. This is what it is trying to say in layman's term. All right. So now moving on forward. Now we are calculating attributable fractions. Basically, in colloquial terms, this just means that if you had to say, if you had to term it in a fraction form, then how would you like do the calculation? So it is just more about the terminology and the writing of it. Okay, so over here now you have, these are the two ones which are highlighted. If you look at the formula for attributable risk, it is IRE minus IRU. So if you see over here, IRE minus IRU, okay, so it is basically attributable fractions over here, all right? So this is the same thing, IRE minus IRU, then it is divided by the same IRE, okay? So basically what was IRE over here? Incidence risk, okay? So it is incidence risk for the exposed group, incidence risk for the unexposed group, divided by incidence risk for the exposed group. So you will have the same number repeated twice. Okay, so it is 20 minus 5, all right, over here, the same. Okay, and then it is divided by 20 again, all right, and then you have 0.75, which is 75%. So 75%, which is 3/4, because it's attributable fractions, it's good to convert your 75 into say 3/4 or less. If you had say 25 into say a quarter of a population, it's the right way of writing for attributable risk, for attributable fractions. All right, so you would say over here 3/4, which is say 75%, or if you can't have an exact 3/4, in some cases, if you had say 78 or something, you can say approximately 3/4, and then in bracket write the actual correct number, which is say 78, if you had an answer 78. All right, so over here it is like this. So 3/4, which is 75% of disease risk. What is our disease risk or exposure risk? That is food poisoning. All right, so 3/4 of food poisoning cases can be attributed to people attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. All right. So if you see at the end, all of the conclusions are the same. It just depends upon which numbers you are using for the calculation. Okay. So none of the conclusions are changing. All conclusions are telling you the same thing, which is if you have gone on the church, if you have gone to the church on Saturday, you are at high risk of food poisoning in comparison to if you have gone to the church on Sunday. All right. So it is just 10 different ways of saying the same thing. So basically, because this is a lecture, I am say telling you all of this in say one lecture. But now do you understand the essence as to why people just report one of these so many variables in an original research article? Because as I said, these are just bivariate associations. These are say the baby steps. Bivariate associations, guys, are the baby step for complicated, further sophisticated analysis. So you don't need to report the same thing 10 times. People just report the relative risk, full stop, and then they look into the data for much more complicated associations, patterns, and relationships. Okay, so that is where you have your quantitative statistics. But basically, as I said, epidemiology is the foundation for your quantitative or qualitative statistics. Now you will appreciate, hopefully, as to why it is the foundation, because it is teaching you the very basics. Okay. All right, so moving further. So now we have a calculation which is called as population attributable proportions and population attributable fractions. So basically it is the same thing, but now you're looking at a population level. All right. So I'll just read it out over here for you. Helps to know how much of the disease risk. For us, it is food poisoning, which is exposure risk. All right. So helps us to know how much of the exposure risk, which is food poisoning, in the whole population, meaning all of the people who attended the church on Sunday versus Saturday, for instance, for our example, that is what is relevant, which is in the whole population can be attributed to exposure, meaning what is our exposure? People attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. Okay. So basically that is what it means. It is like considering all of the number. Now the definition or the explanation is so clearly saying whole population, whole population. So if you see over here in the, when I show you this slide, you will see as to how the whole population number is included. All right. But let's get back to this slide again. Whereas where you had attributable risk, okay, which is what we studied earlier, AR, only tells us how much of the disease risk, which is food poisoning exposure risk, can be attributed to the exposure, meaning people attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. Over here, attributable risk does not take the whole population into consideration, basically. All right. So in the bigger picture, why is it important that say big data sets, governmental data set, may be calculating population attributable risk or proportion, population attributable proportions or fractions, is because, for example, it helps us to measure the disease burden. What do I mean by disease burden? For example, the church which we have taken in our example, okay, which it could be, say, situated in Belconnen. Okay, so it's a church in Westfield Belconnen, and we are saying that the church in Westfield Belconnen had food poisoning cases for so and so people who attended on Saturday versus Sunday. Okay, but the disease burden for this is very, very tiny. Why? Because it is not that all the churches in Australia had the same disease burden and all of them suffered from food poisoning, and the cases all over Australia were greater for Saturday in comparison to Sunday. No. Okay, so the disease burden in our example is very, very small, very, very tiny. Okay, because it is just concerning to one little community, which is, say, a church in Westfield Belconnen. But as I said, that you will have to appreciate this sort of calculation is done more at a governmental level, at a population level. At that time, this makes a lot more sense to see what is the disease burden of this exposure or this condition. For example, right now, this sort of calculations would be perfect for, say, COVID. Okay, so what is the mortality rate, morbidity rate? If we say that is perfect for COVID, calculating the PAP and PAFs would be perfect for a COVID situation, because it is affecting not only a country, it is affecting the entire globe. All right. Okay, guys. So the calculations for your PAP and PAFs is like this. So I'll just first I'll just move myself. All right. So yes, you have Saturday, you had 20 people. Sunday, you had 5 people. You total this people. Okay, 25. This is what it means, like the whole population. Okay, so helps to know how much of the disease risk, which is exposure risk, food poisoning, in the whole population can be attributed to the exposure. And our exposure is people attending church on Saturday in comparison to Sunday. Okay, so this is what it means by whole population, but you have to appreciate this is just a tiny example to explain you the concept. Therefore, our whole population is not really whole population. Okay, it's a very tiny population. So yes, we have 20 plus 5, which is 25. Similarly, over here, you have your Saturday's population, which did not have food poisoning, and Sunday's population, which did not have food poisoning, which was 110. Okay, and that all of these totals are at the bottom. All right. So now we can say that in total, there are 25 cases, okay, which are there in the yes food poisoning column. Okay, so they have been exposed, all right, to food poisoning. Then of which 20 subjects, okay, of which 20 subjects had the exposure of interest. This is very, very important. 25 people had food poisoning, but 20 people, these 20 people had the exposure of interest. Now, guys, this is how it would be written in a textbook, exposure of interest. But then you have to backtrack and think, okay, so what is my exposure of interest? Yes, people who attended the church on Saturday. That is my exposure of interest, because we have classified people who attended church on Saturday as severe food poisoning case. Okay. So that is, say, our you know how you have your control group and your intervention group. Of course, there is no intervention in this, but basically, or else in a case control study, you know how you have your cases. So these are our cases. People who attended the church on Saturday, they are our cases, severe food poisoning cases. Okay. So now what does it mean? Which means 20 of the 25 people. Okay. So when you divide 20 divided by 25, you get 0.8, which is 80%. Okay. Which means 80% of the people, subjects meaning the people, all right? 80% of the people had the exposure of interest. Yes, what is our exposure of interest? Severe food poisoning, which people experienced on Saturday, okay? So guys, I'll get back to that. Let me first complete this. Therefore, 80% of the proportion of the population had the exposure of interest, which is severe food poisoning, okay? Now, this is your calculation for PAP. So your calculation for PAP is already done. And guys, by the time you come to this slide, and if you forget, oh, which was my exposure of interest, I'll quickly go back to the first slide where we did the calculation, because see, this is where I have clearly written severely exposed, okay, and mildly exposed. This is our exposure of interest. Okay, so just in case if you forget it, because I had to keep fitting a lot more things in the slide in the coming slides. So I haven't written these yellow and green bits everywhere. Okay, but remember it in this way. Okay, now I'll come back to the slide which we were on. Okay, and don't worry, I don't have corona. Okay, it's just when it's too cold, I get runny nose. So it's just because it's too cold. I'm a tropical person. I love the heat. I love summers. All right, so yes, this is where we were. So guys, your PAP is done. Okay, your population attributable proportion calculation is already done. Very, very simple calculation. Okay, so now let's read this, because now we'll be calculating PAF, population attributable fractions. All right, so from our previous calculation of the attributable fractions, the attributable fraction was 0.75, which is 75%. I have color coded this for you. I'll just show you. It was on this slide. Okay, so your 0.75, 75, you calculated attributable fractions. Okay, your AFS. All right. So that is what I'm saying over here. All right, so you can connect the dots. So from our previous calculation of the attributable fractions, your AFs or AFS is how I've written over there. My apologies. All right. The attributable fraction was 0.75, which is 75%. Okay, no problem. Therefore, for the entire population, the fraction of cases that can be attributable to exposure of interest. What is our exposure of interest? Now I have clearly told you, which is severe food poisoning. All right. Is your 0.8, this is your color coding again, is your 0.8 into 0.75. All right. So what is PAF? It is attributable fraction multiplied by your PAP, which is population attributable proportion. So what is it? 60%. So our PAF is 60%. All right. And this is what you can write in a fraction form if you were to write it in a sentence. All right. Like 3/4, 3/4, the same idea which I gave you. Okay. So isn't it easy? The calculations. The PF and PAP and PAFs are like pretty easy to calculate. All of these calculation, guys, this week are pretty easy. So rest assured, it's not very complicated. And the most complicated part is over, which is not that complicated. All right. So now we come on to the second bit, which is calculating odds ratio. All right. So as I said, odds ratio, again, most commonly reported in your original research. Which type of original research? Case control studies, cross-sectional studies, and over here you have all the liberty to write your statements as the odds of something, okay? But remember, when you are calculating risk ratios, please write it in terms of risk, okay? Because it's not right scientifically if you write that as odds, all right? Okay, so yes, the ratio of the odds of event occurring in the exposed group versus the unexposed group. All right, so that is basically the textbook definition of odds ratios. All right, so calculated in case control studies, cross-sectional studies. All right, it is calculated basically when the incidence of an outcome is not known. All right, that is important. Why? Because you are not following these are case control studies. These are cross-sectional studies. In case control studies, the event has already occurred, okay? Meaning you already have smokers, you already have non-smokers, okay? These are case control studies. In prospective cohort studies, you're following these people for 10 years and you're seeing, do they develop cancer at some stage in their life within this 10 years? So over here, the incidence of the outcome is not known, okay? Whether they will be having cancer or not having cancer, okay? So basically, this is what I roughly mean by incidence of the outcome not known, all right? It all depends upon the type of study you're doing and your research question. The interpretation, guys, is the same, which is greater than 1 odds ratios, meaning increased occurrence of an event, less than 1 odd ratio, decreased occurrence of an event, okay? Which is a good thing, decrease occurrence of an event if you put your numbers correctly in your formula. All right, so now I'll show you an example. So yes, these people were smoking. No, these people were not smoking. And those who were smoking, how many of them had cancers? And those who were smoking and they were lucky, they never had cancer. Okay. Those who were not smoking, but they still had cancer. Okay. So it could be because of, it doesn't mean that, and guys, this is where I'll come to that point. It's like I have so much of knowledge to share with you that I don't want to jump hoops. I'll come to that point. And over here you have, no, they were not smoking and no, they did not have cancer. Very nice and lucky group. Okay. So guys, again, over here, see, you know, why am I saying that these calculations which I'm showing you, this is like the basic epidemiology, because over here, if you say, like for a real research paper, okay, you say yes, that so many people were smoking and so many of them had cancer. But in real life, if I do this calculation, yes, first I'll do a bivariate analysis. This is called a bivariate analysis, okay? Odds ratios are basically bivariate analysis over here, where you have two variables, which is smoking and cancer. Your smoking is your IV, your cancer is your DV, and you are trying to understand the association between your IV and DV, okay? Because this entire lecture is about understanding associations and predominantly understanding associations between your IV and DV, okay? So, yes. So over here, I would say in my research paper that, yeah, so many people were smoking, of which these many people had cancer, all right? But now, in a multivariate analysis, what I would do, I would start looking at what other variables could be responsible for this person developing cancer, meaning smoking as a independent variable, how much of that is responsible for the person causing cancer? Do these people have cancer because of any other reason apart from smoking? Is it because they are so stressed? Is it because they are even chewing tobacco? Is it because they are working in an industry where they are exposed to a lot of radiation? So many reasons. Okay, so that is what is the beauty of multivariate analysis. You can't just simply say in a research paper that, yes, because these people were smoking and so many of them had cancer, that's why smoking causes cancer. No. This is just the very first level of epidemiology. You're just finding the bivariate association. Then you start looking at various other confounding factors. You start looking at various other covariates and looking at how much of these covariates are explaining the relationship between them and cancer. Okay, so those are multivariate analysis. So basically, what am I saying? This is the step one of your research. Okay, so now what is the formula? So all these blue highlighted boxes are your formula. Okay, so you have your A into D. So A into D, it's a cross multiplication. You have your B into C. So B into C. And then just add in the numbers and divided, you have the number 4 as your answer. So individuals smoking are 4 times more likely to develop cancer than individuals who do not smoke. Okay, so this is not wrong to report like this. So it's fine. Individuals smoking are 4 times more likely. Now see, this is the other way of writing results for odds ratios. I haven't even used the terms odd. Okay, I have just said likely. And if you are getting confused between how to write the same statement with, say, the word risk versus odds, just use the term likely. Likely is like Switzerland. Likely is a neutral term. Okay, you can use it anywhere. All right, with risk ratios, odds ratios. Okay, so it's a safe term to use. So individuals smoking are 4 times more likely to develop cancer than individuals who are not smoking. Yes, that is right. This is what I would also report in my research paper. Then I would do multivariate analysis and try to find out how much of smoking is responsible for the cancer. Are there any other factors which are responsible for cancer? That is where multivariate analysis comes into the picture. So I hope you holistically understand this picture. It is basically, if I had to teach epi just textbook wise, this is where I would stop, that this is how you calculate odds ratios, full stop. No, but how is that going to be applicable for your real life, right, guys? So basically, when I teach, I want you to understand that, yes, we are doing this calculation in the context of, say, real life research. Where does this calculation sit? How much important it is? And how is it, and what are the next steps to it? All right, so these are the type of questions which I'm trying to answer, so you can understand the holistic picture of where this component of epidemiology sits. All right, so now guys, we will calculate attributable fractions. I promise you these are the last calculations, okay, for this lecture. All right, so now we will calculate attributable fractions, AF, and population attributable fractions, PAF, with odds ratios. All right, so now it is important to understand that we cannot calculate the true incidence rate, okay, new cases, because you cannot know the new case, because you already have in your case control study 2 group: people who have cancer, people who do not have cancer, people who are smoking, people who are not smoking. You're not following them for 10 years, okay, to see whether these people started smoking and whether those people who started smoking developed cancer, and those who did not start smoking, did they still develop cancer? So, you know, that is a true incidence rate, meaning the new cases which have developed. You can really calculate the true incidence rate when you have a prospective study, a longitudinal study. But that's not the case with case control studies and cross-sectional studies. Okay, so this is basically you calculate AF and your PAF when with odds ratios, because in this case you cannot calculate the true incidence rate. All right, so that is most important. So basically, how do you calculate this? We calculate that, therefore the AF and PF which you calculate with using odds ratios, they are called as proxy attributable fractions and proxy population attributable fractions. Okay, so basically they are proxy because they are not true incidence rate, as I said. Okay, so now when you have AF with odds ratios, how do you calculate them? So you have odds ratios -1 divided by odds ratios into 100. Okay, and similarly, this is the formula. It looks like a big scary formula, but trust me, it's very easy. Okay, this is the formula for your PAF using odds ratios. So these are all proxy indicators. Okay, so now this was our simple common box where you had your people with cancer, no cancer, smoking, and no smoking. Okay, so from the previous slide, we know that the odds ratio is 4. So again, it is C color coded for you. Okay, so this was our 4 over here. Okay, so that is the one which I'm taking in this calculation. All right, so you have your odds ratios as 4. So now insert it in the formula. So you have this as your formula. So you have your 4 minus 1 divided by 4 into 100. This gives you 75. Okay. So 75% of cancer among subjects smoking could be attributed to the fact that they were smoking. Okay. 75% of the cancer, maybe because they were smoking. I'm saying maybe. Why? Because these are not multivariate analysis. All right. I would have to look at many other factors which could be responsible or could be associated with cancer. As I said, the type of job, excessive radiation exposure, stress, tobacco chewing, all of those stuff. Okay. So basically, yes, therefore 75% of cancer could be prevented in the subject sample if they were not smoking, which makes sense. Okay, so if they were not smoking, so yes, 75% of the cancer could be preventable. All right. So it is, as I said, it's okay to say this at a bivariate level, but in a real life research paper, you would have to do much more analysis to come to this conclusion. Okay, multivariate analysis. All right, so now we calculate your PAFs. Okay, so again, we know that your odds ratio is 4. Okay, so it's same color coded. Now we look at this number over here, 55 people. Okay, meaning no, they were not smoking, but they developed cancer. All right, so these are the poor unlucky people. Okay, so they were not smoking, but they still have cancer. All right. So of the 110 controls, again, this is color coded for you. Okay, so these are not smoking people. So these are your cases. These are your controls. Yes, I've written it also, which is good. Okay, so cases and controls. So of the total 110 control, okay, so again, this is population attributable risk. So remember over here, this is a tiny example. So our population is really tiny. Okay, so of the 110 control, meaning people who are not smoking, 55%, which is 50% of the people had cancer. Okay, yes, that's correctly said. All right. So they were exposed to the disease, okay, even though they were not smoking. All right. So this 50% can tell us the PAF. All right. So we will see how it can tell us the PAF. But this 50% can tell us the PAF. That is, what does it mean? Proportion of all cancers that could be attributed to smoking. All right. So now we see how. Again, input it into the formula. So, right, so this population exposure is basically your this, all right, 0.50. Okay, so your this PE, population exposure, is 0.50. This is the same thing. Odds ratio we know is 4, 1. Okay, your 0.50 odds ratio we know is 4, 1 plus 1. You use the BODMAS rule whenever you do these calculations, which have lots of bracket. Okay, if you don't recall the BODMAS rule, please look at YouTube videos. Okay, that's basic maths. All right, so then you come to PAF, which is 60%. So how would you say this in a sentence? Okay, and as I said, we are talking about population attributable fractions. So it is a good practice to write this in terms of fractions. Okay, which is 3/5, which is around 60%. Okay, so 3/5 of all cancers due to smoking could be prevented if all subjects who were with cancer, who were without cancer, stopped smoking. Okay, so 60% of all cancers due to smoking could be prevented if all subjects stopped smoking. All right. So see, this is how, guys, when this sort of data is reported in, say, in these big governmental document, they give you good impact statements. Okay, so basically such kind of bivariate analysis, which calculate odds ratios for you, which calculate risk ratios for you, this PAFs for you, AFs for you, they give you good impact statements. Okay, so for example, in Australia, you have 1 in 4 people in Australia are suffering from diabetes. See, it's such a strong impact statement. So these bivariate calculations, they give you good impact statements. Okay, so they are not that they are useless. They are absolutely not useless, but they are the step 1. And then you need to investigate much more in detail to see if there are any, how strong is the association between smoking and cancer. Okay, the strength of the association can be seen with specific multivariate analysis. All right. And to even see if there are any other variables which may be responsible for the outcome, which is cancer. Okay, so that is where multivariate analysis plays a role. This gives you strong impact statement. It is easier for the layman, the population, the common public to understand. Therefore, very, very useful in, say, governmental setting, governmental reports. It makes, say, these mumbo jumbo data, big numbers, simple to understand. Okay. And that is why I kept highlighting, and I tried making such impact statements for each of your calculation that we did. So you can see how this may be relatable to what you may have read in some newspaper or some governmental report. All right. Okay, guys. So now, okay, the last bit of this lecture is to understand two important concepts, which I said were continued from your, say, lecture 2, which is reliability and validity. Okay. So what is reliability, validity? We'll come to that, but do remember that the threats to reliability, validity, I have made several slides for you regarding that for your post readings. Again, they are not compulsory, but if you are taking up research, then definitely go through that. And especially if you are, if at all, if you are considering doing research with me, certainly go through those things, because we take these concepts, because you will see the kind of examples that I'll give you in understanding reliability, validity. I take a lot of these things into consideration, because the more you take reliability and validity into consideration while planning your research design, your methods, your calculation, the stronger results you have. Okay, so it will all make sense when I explain it to you. But yes, if you are doing real life research, please pay attention to reliability and validity. Okay, and of course you can discuss this further with your supervisors in the near future. All right, guys, so first we'll look at validity. All right, so basically what is validity? Sorry, I'll again move myself. Okay, all right, so what is validity? It is the accuracy of your measurement tool. Okay, so basically, is it measuring what it is actually supposed to measure? Okay, so for example, if you have a weighing scale, it should measure your weight. Okay, it shouldn't, the weighing scale shouldn't say, oh yes, you are 160 centimeter tall. No, but you're not a measuring tape, you're a weighing scale. You should be accurately measuring my weight. Okay, so it should tell you you're 50 kgs or things like that. All right, so yes, in simple terms, validity means is that, is it measuring what it is actually supposed to measure? Okay, and obviously accurately. All right, then what are the types of validity? All right, so wherever possible, I'll try to give you example as to how would you really measure this validity in real life. Okay, so the types of validity are, the first one is Kritish validity. So what does it mean? It means whether the instrument procedure is measuring what it should measure. Okay, so for example, yes, if I give you an IQ test or an aptitude test, it should measure your IQ or your aptitude. Okay, an IQ test should give me IQ scores, not EQ scores, emotional quotient. Okay, I need to know your intellectual quotient, not your emotional quotient. So basically, if I design a questionnaire, and which is what I have done in my that picky eating research, which I'm currently doing. Okay, so basically, in my research, I have designed a questionnaire where I want to measure the picky eating food practices of children. Okay, so how much are the children picky towards specific fruits, veggies, core, non-core foods, and things like that. Okay, so in this context, my questionnaire should actually measure picky eating. Then it shouldn't measure something else, like say, for instance, how much the child say loves to play games or sports. That wouldn't make sense. Okay, so that is what Kritish validity means. It means you have a tool. What is your tool supposed to measure, and is it measuring that? Okay, then face validity. What is face validity? It means have your participants clearly understood the purpose of your instrument or the procedure which you're asking them to do. Okay, so for instance, how did I make sure that my participants understood this? So basically, when I developed the questionnaire, I piloted my questionnaire. Okay, so I gave it to mothers to complete, and the mothers had to rate their child as a picky eater on a scale of 1 to 10, like you know how you have a Likert scale. So they rated their child on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not picky, 10 being very picky, and then there were certain fruits, veggies in the list. Okay, so it was sort of a food frequency questionnaire. Basically, after the mothers completed this, I had an interview session with them. I had a face-to-face interview with them, and I asked them, what did they understand? Okay, so did they understand what they were doing as part of completing the questionnaire? What is their interpretation of what is it that they were completing? Okay, and then they said, yes, we think that we are rating our child's picky eating behavior. How much do we think that our child is picky or not picky? So yes, bingo, spot on. They understood the purpose of the questionnaire. All right. So this is saying it in very simple colloquial terms, but basically face validity is, it's just simply understanding whether your participants have understood the tool, the procedure. And this can be done, for instance, by having some small little interview sessions with them, focus groups with them, so on and so forth. Okay. Then you have content validity. So what does content validity mean? It means a instrument which measures all aspects or all domains of what it is supposed to measure. Meaning, I have given you an IQ example over here, but I'll give you a very recent example. So I have a PhD student and she is looking into developing a quality of life questionnaire for individuals with type 1 diabetes. Okay. So now when she looked at the literature, how people have defined quality of life for type 1 diabetic individual is they have looked at their, say, social quality of life, physiological quality of life. So, physically and socially, emotionally. Okay, these were, say, the three main factors they have considered in considering quality of life. One of the very, very important factor for a type 1 diabetic individual is their dietary management. Okay, because diabetes is a disease which needs very strong dietary management. Okay, so you cannot ignore dietary management. But none of these questionnaires which are out there, they looked at dietary management as one of the important factor which would affect their quality of life. So now she developed an entire new questionnaire where she took the emotional, social, physiological aspects, these domains from the existing questionnaire, but then she came up with her own dietary domain, and now she's going to validate this questionnaire in the future. Okay, so basically this is a complete questionnaire because it is measuring all aspects of quality of life which is related to a type 1 diabetic individual. Okay, so hope that makes sense. All right, so now you have construct validity. Within construct validity, you have two types of validity. You have convergent validity and you have divergent validity. So what does convergent validity mean? It means that examines basically data which is obtained from two different procedures or instruments. So I'll tell you what this means. So for instance, in my picky eating study, as I said, I have developed one questionnaire, right? The picky eating questionnaire. Now there is a similar questionnaire which is there, which is existing in the literature. Similar meaning it is measuring, say, children's food preferences, what they like or dislike. But there are many factors which are not considered in that questionnaire. But at least it will tell me the same thing. Meaning if the mother says on my questionnaire, my child hate tomatoes, and she gave the rating, say 2 out of 10, no, 9 out of 10, which is very, very picky, she will have the same opportunity to say on this external questionnaire, which is done by some other researcher, that she can give the same rating or a different rating for tomato on the researcher's questionnaire. So in my questionnaire, I have tomato. In the external questionnaire, which is published in the research, there is a tomato. Okay, and the mother can give the rating on both of these questionnaire. All right. So basically, I did this with a subset of mother. I did this with, say, 50 odd mother, and I asked them to complete my questionnaire and the existing questionnaire in the research. If they rate my child hates tomato in both of these questionnaire, meaning this covers my ground of convergent validity, meaning that they are reporting the same thing irrespective of the questionnaire type. What does it mean? It means they are understanding and interpreting my questionnaire correctly. Okay, so this is what is meant by convergent validity. All right, so now divergent validity. So what does divergent validity mean? It means that whether, so as I said, how you have in my PhD students questionnaire, you have these four construct. Okay, so you have social, you have physiological, you have psychological, and you have dietary. Okay, So basically, you shouldn't be having one construct which is say one or more constructs which are so similar in nature that you don't really need to make them into a construct. Now guys, basically what does construct mean? It means, say, a questionnaire may have 4 parts to it. Okay, so it may have rate your, say, social quality of life, rate your physiological quality of life, rate your psychological quality of life, and rate your dietary quality of life. And each of these construct may have, say, subset of 4 questions or 3 questions. So this is called as a construct. Okay, so social construct, and within that you have 4 questions. Dietary construct, within that you may have 6 questions. So these 6 questions in total is a dietary construct. Does that make sense? So basically, divergent validity means that no 2 construct of yours should be so similar that they don't really need to be 2 different construct. They can just be 1 construct. Okay, so how would you test this? You can test this using, say, sophisticated analysis such as structural equation modeling and confirmatory factor analysis. Okay, so you can do certain statistical techniques to test convergent validity and divergent validity. Okay, so yes, there are practical ways of doing it, but it is always important to support these practical ways with quantifiable data. You know how it is. Okay, you will be listening to the tutorial after this. So in your tutorial, I have given an example is that you can know the normality of a data set visually using histograms, but you should support your visual interpretation with numbers, meaning some statistics. Okay, so now when you listen to the tutorials, you will remember this, which I have said in the lecture. It will make all sense to you. Okay, so now I'll move on to the next one, which is internal validity. So what is internal validity? It is the confidence that the independent variable has only caused the outcome or dependent variable. Okay, so basically, how can you have this confidence? As I said, if you say confidently that in my sample, smoking is the only variable that has caused cancer, well, for you to make this statement, have you control for all of the other confounding factors or all of the other sort of, say, reasons as to why an individual may have cancer? If not, you cannot say that statement. Okay, so that is what it means by internal validity. Internal validity, again, it becomes much more stronger if you have a strong research design, such as, say, a randomized control trial or as a prospective cohort study. All right. External validity is the generalization of your findings, meaning you saw in our, say, example that, for instance, if I'm looking at picky eating behavior among children in, say, Canberra. Okay, so hypothetically speaking. And in my sample within Canberra, I found that children who are living in Canberra, who are 7 to 12 years of age, are picky eaters. Now, I cannot generalize this finding to all of the children in Australia who are 7 to 12 years of age who would be picky eaters. That would be absolutely wrong. Okay, so how can you generalize? How can you strengthen your external validity? Again, that comes to, say, your methodological procedure. If you have followed a good sampling technique, which is again part of, say, more what do you say? It is more in terms of research planning and quantitative data analysis. So if you have a good sampling technique, all right, so say stratified sampling technique, stratified random sampling technique, then you are more confident in saying that what I saw in my sample may be applicable to the children, say, wider than my sample. Okay, so say within Australia. All right, so how can you be confident with your external validity? Well, you'll have to go back to having a good sampling technique as one of the, say, examples. All right. Okay, guys, so now reliability. So now with reliability, what does reliability mean? It means it is the consistency in a measurement or precision. What does it mean? It means that even if you stand on your weighing scale 100 times, if it tells you that you are 50 kg or 60 kg, well, then it's right. Okay, so as long as it is giving you the same reading 100 times. Okay, but remember over here, if it is not valid in the first place, meaning if it is not, say, accurate in the first place, It may make you happy by saying, oh, you are 50 kg, but what if the scale is broken and it always gives you 50 kg? Even if you stand on it, I stand on it, even if an elephant stands on it, if it's always going to give 50 kg, is that really precise? No, because it's not valid in the first place. Does that make sense? Okay, so validity and reliability go hand in hand. The instrument should be valid, meaning it should give you correct readings, and reliable, meaning even if you take the readings 10 times on that accurate scale, it will give you the same numbers. Okay, so that is what is meant by reliability. All right, so precision. All right, so now test retest reliability. I'll give you an example again with test retest reliability. So how did I do test retest reliability? So for instance, I asked my mother to come, I asked the mothers which were there in my study to complete the questionnaire, right? And then within 2 weeks of time, how did I decide that 2 weeks? Because that is what was informed in the literature. That's why I said when you develop your methodology, it's so important to read the literature. Okay. So in my literature, it says that because I'm making a new questionnaire, so I told my mothers to complete my questionnaire, my newly developed questionnaire. And then I asked the same mothers within 2 weeks to complete the same questionnaire, which is my new questionnaire again. Okay. And then I will be comparing their scores. Meaning I want to see if the mother says that my child hate tomatoes and she gave, say in week 1, okay, which is say 9 out of 10. And maybe within 2 weeks, she said that my child hate tomatoes and she gave 8 out of 10. Okay, fine. It is still close by. All right. But what if there were mothers who said in the first week that my child hate tomatoes and suddenly within a 2 weeks time, she says, no, my child absolutely love tomatoes. Okay, now there is something wrong going on over here. Okay, either she has just completed the questionnaire to get rid of me, all right, which does happen sometimes. Actually, like it would happen a lot of times, especially because when I did my PhD, some people were not interested to participate, but they still felt pity on me and they participated, but they did a horrible job in completing the questionnaire. And some of them were amazing and they really wanted to support you as a student. And they did a fantastic job in giving honest, genuine response in the questionnaire. Okay. So these are the type of things it helps to test retest reliability. Okay. Meaning they will help me to measure the precision of my instrument. Are they giving you the same trend of response for the same tool at different time points? Okay, test retest reliability. Now, inter-rater reliability, what is that? It means where you have 2 or more trained researchers who are recording the observations and both of them are reporting the same results. So I'll give you an example over here. How was this done? So when I was doing my postdoctoral research at Western Sydney University, I was giving a diabetic education session to say individuals with type 2 diabetes. So over there, I had an observer. Okay, she recorded my she recorded basically what she had a checklist and she recorded the content of, like, am I covering all of this content? Then she recorded the participants' expression, their questions, their observations. So she had a big list to see. Basically, she wanted to see how effective is the nutrition education session, which is provided by myself. Okay, as one of the person, as a person who is providing intervention to the target audience. All right. And then my session was recorded by another researcher on the same checklist. So they were completely independent. Okay. They didn't know each other or anything. And then they matched their scores and both of them gave me the same scores, meaning saying that the sessions which I'm giving to my group of people as an intervention, it has consistency. Okay. So reliability is so much about consistency, right? So yes, I'm giving consistent sessions to my participant audience, and therefore I'm a good person to give intervention because I keep consistent across various groups. All right. So basically that is what is meant by inter-rater reliability, where you have 2 or more people who are observing and then you are comparing their scores to see whether it's giving the same sort of results and pattern. All right. So basically, guys, all of these concepts, I have tried to explain it to you in terms of examples because it just becomes easier for you to remember these concepts. But remember, this can be applied to a measurement tool. It can be applied to a procedure. So my measurement tool example is what I have generally given you, like the questionnaire, but it can be applied to a procedure as well. So as I said, I'm looking at picky eating behavior, but I'm looking at phenotype, taste sensitivity as well. All right. So the procedure over here is where the children are having the prop testing solutions to see if they are super tasters or not. Now, this is a procedure. This is an experiment. So you can actually have reliability and validity tested even for this sort of things. All right. So you can test it for procedures. You can test it for instruments is what I'm trying to say. Okay. And the last one which we have is overall reliability or internal consistency. So what does that mean? It means that the construct, this is very similar to your construct validity. So the construct which you have developed, is it measuring what it is supposed to measure? Meaning if we look at our PhD students, my PhD students question example, the quality of life one, she has developed a dietary construct, right? So the 6 questions that she has under the dietary construct, are these 6 questions relevant? Are they measuring dietary things? And if they are relevant and if they are measuring, all of them are rightfully in the right construct, which is the dietary construct, then the reliability will be very, very high. And how do you test for internal consistency or the construct consistency? You do a Cronbach alpha score. Okay, so these are just tentative, good, excellent. This is not hard and fast because each research topic, each area of research will have different definitions of what is good, bad, excellent for them. Okay, but this is generally for social sciences is what I'm showing you. So now over here, for example, a Cronbach alpha, which is what you do in SPSS, again, internal consistencies you calculate. So if the dietary construct, the 6 questions, okay, so when I put data for these 6 questions for the dietary construct in SPSS, and if it gives me an answer of say greater or equal to 0.9 Cronbach alpha, so this alpha is the sign for Cronbach alpha, then this has excellent internal consistency, meaning all of these 6 questions are rightfully and appropriately in one construct, which is the dietary construct, because all of them are measuring dietary related behavior and aspects of quality of life. Make sense? Okay. So yes, guys, that is where we end today. Remember that you do have some post readings, which is say threats to reliability and validity. Okay, this is not assessed, don't worry, it won't be there in your quizzes or any such time in your accessible items, but please do go through this. This is more extra information if you are doing a, say, a full-time research or some sort of research in your future careers, then this would be very, very helpful for you to understand. Okay, so I won't go through all of this, but I just thought, because I used to teach a very research oriented unit, which was called as research methods, where you teach about sampling and all of that. So a research methods unit previously in one of the universities. So I just thought of adding it over here in case if a couple of you are taking research pathways, then it's useful to be, aware of these threats to internal validity and reliability. Okay, so yes, guys, that's about it. We are done for today. And yes, please have a look at the tutorials as well for this week. And I'll see you in the next tute and the next lecture, all right, online. All right, so I'll just properly do this. Okay, I'll see you next week.